There's something about a forbidden love story that always leaves us uneasy, isn't there? Imagine a young woman named Maria, whose heart was filled with passion for a man her family would never approve of. How many of us have felt the weight of choices no one else seemed to understand? Maria, however, did the unthinkable. She ran away with him, defying everything and everyone, believing that the love they shared would be enough to overcome any barrier. But did that choice bring the happiness she so desperately sought? Far from her family's expectations and control, Maria and her love began to build a life together. At first, life seemed like a dream, far from the critical eyes and judgments of her family. Freedom, love, and the promise of a bright future filled Maria's days. There were no more limits or impositions. They were alone, and that was all they needed. Or at least, that's what Maria believed, until fate began to weave its dark threads. Everything changed with the arrival of their children, two beautiful kids who, to Maria, symbolized the unconditional love she and her husband shared. They were the result of her choices, proof that everything had been worth it. But as we'll see, not everything that glitters is gold. And what seemed like the happy ending to a fairy tale soon became the prelude to an unimaginable tragedy. As time passed, Maria's family seemed complete. The arrival of the two children brought a new dimension to the couple's life. The kids were the light of Maria's days, the reflection of the love she believed would last forever. Every smile, every child's laugh was a reminder that running away had been the right choice, at least for her. Her husband, though distant at times, also seemed captivated by the beauty of the life they had built. But like many things in life, calmness doesn't always last forever. Maria devoted herself entirely to raising her children, putting her whole heart and soul into being a loving mother. Her days were filled with caring for the kids, their laughter filling the house and giving her a sense of purpose. What was once a love just between her and her husband now extended to a deep bond with their children. And in that environment of joy and fulfillment, Maria allowed herself to believe that, despite everything, her life was perfect. But there's something dangerous about blindly trusting in that perfection. While she was immersed in the role of mother and wife, the man who had once been her great love began to show signs of growing distant. Small details that Maria, in her unconditional love, chose to ignore. After all, the children were there to reinforce the idea that her sacrifice had been rewarded. But when love starts to fade, cracks inevitably appear, and what Maria didn't know was that her family, built on the foundation of love, was about to crumble in a tragic way. It was on an ordinary afternoon when Maria's world began to crumble. While she took care of the children and maintained the household routine, she started to notice something different about her husband's behavior. He was growing increasingly distant, his outings frequent and unexplained, and their conversations had become rare and superficial. What used to be affection and tenderness now felt like nothing more than an obligation. Maria, who had always believed in the unconditional love that bound them, felt a growing unease in her chest. But what she discovered soon after was far more devastating than any suspicion or doubt. One night, Maria followed her husband, driven by an instinct she desperately wished was wrong. With each step, her heart raced, as if it already knew the truth, but still refused to accept it. And then she saw him. The scene she witnessed felt like the ground was ripped from beneath her feet. Her beloved, the man for whom she had sacrificed everything, was with another woman. The touch that once belonged only to her was now shared with someone else, and the kiss that was supposed to be eternal was now given to someone who wasn't her. Maria felt her world shatter into 1,000 pieces before her eyes. The discovery of the betrayal was like a deep blow to Maria's soul. What was once love now turned into pain, and what had once meant security now became synonymous with despair. She returned home without feeling the ground beneath her feet, silent tears streaming down her face. In that moment, Maria's heart didn't just break, it shattered into a kind of anguish that no one else could ever understand. And so the beginning of her downfall was marked by the unbearable pain of betrayal. Maria could barely breathe. The pain of the betrayal ate away at her soul, turning what little hope remained into sheer despair. The feeling of having lost everything she had fought to build was overwhelming. The man she loved had cruelly betrayed her trust, and as much as she tried to find strength, the weight of the suffering was unbearable. Her children, who once represented her safe harbor, now seemed like constant reminders of the life she believed she had, but that, in reality, was falling apart. With each passing day, Maria's sadness turned into something darker, something she could no longer control. The nights became endless. As her husband continued to go out, Maria stayed home alone, lost in painful thoughts, imagining every detail of the betrayal. Her mind, once calm and loving, was now a whirlwind of anger, pain, and despair. She no longer knew who she was. Everything she knew, everything she loved, felt distant and unreachable. Her children looked at her with innocent eyes, not understanding what was happening, and that only made things worse. How could she continue to be the mother they needed when she no longer even recognized herself? That's when the anger began to take hold. Every painful thought turned into a wave of fury. She felt trapped, as if her life no longer belonged to her. And amidst the chaos consuming her mind, an idea began to take shape. Something dark, something she never thought she could feel. The pain had transformed Maria into someone else, and in that moment she was about to make a decision that would change her life forever, and the lives of her children. Despair had finally taken over. On that fateful night, Maria's mind was shrouded in a fog of despair and rage. The dark thoughts that consumed her finally found a way out. In her twisted pain, she began to see her children as symbols of the marriage that had failed, the last ties binding her to the betrayal her husband had committed. Her eyes, once filled with love, were now clouded with anguish. The pain was so overwhelming that her own reason seemed to slip away. Without thinking, she took the children to the lake, the place that used to bring peace to her soul. The water, cold and silent, offered no resistance. The despair that gripped Maria led her to commit the unthinkable. Her children, defenseless and confused, were given over to the lake as if that act could somehow ease her pain. The deed, as quick as it was thoughtless, was accompanied only by the sound of the water and the oppressive silence of the night. The small hands she had once held with such love now disappeared beneath the surface, and in that moment, Maria believed she was erasing the pain that consumed her. But the darkness that overtook her soul was far deeper than the lake. When it was all over, an absolute silence filled the place. Maria, still not fully grasping what she had done, stood there, watching the lake's surface return to its natural calm, as if nothing had happened. But something terrible had happened, something that could never be undone. In that instant, the gravity of her actions began to sink in, and the horror of what she had done started to flood her mind. Maria's life had changed forever, and what followed was the beginning of a journey through guilt and torment that would consume her for the rest of her days. The return to the river was immediate, as if something deep within Maria, a primal instinct, pulled her back to the place where everything had happened. The shock made her run, her bare feet barely feeling the cold, damp ground as the moon, high in the sky, seemed to be the only silent witness to her despair. The lake, once a refuge of peace for her tormented soul, was now the stage of her tragedy. Upon reaching the shore, Maria screamed her children's names, her desperate voice blending with the sound of the calm waters. She hoped that somehow this was all a nightmare from which she could wake up. Reality, however, was relentless. The waters still appeared calm, indifferent to what had happened. Maria's heart, on the other hand, was in a furious storm. She stepped into the lake, her clothes soaking through, her body trembling with cold and fear. In the darkness, her eyes desperately searched for any sign of her children. The weight of guilt pressed on her shoulders like an anchor, sinking her deeper into her own pain. Deep in her mind, she knew that nothing could change what she had done, but her maternal instinct screamed louder, pushing her to search for the impossible. When Maria crossed the lake, what she found on the other side was devastating. The bodies of her children lay still, pale under the light of the moon. The shock was immediate, but the pain that followed was even worse. Maria fell to her knees, arms outstretched toward the small bodies, unable to believe that the very children she had loved so much were now dead by her own hands. The desperate cries that echoed through the air were not enough to wake them, but they would reverberate through time, transforming into the legend of La Llorona. The horrific discovery of her children's lifeless bodies was like a fatal blow to Maria. There, before the cold, motionless bodies of her children, she felt her world collapse completely. The lake, once a symbol of serenity and peace, had now become a living reminder of her guilt and regret. What remained of her sanity crumbled in that moment. Every detail of her children's bodies was etched into her mind, immortalizing the horror of her actions. Maria held them in her arms, but the warmth of life was gone, replaced by the chilling touch of death. The weight of their small bodies in Maria's arms seemed to symbolize the enormity of her mistake. Her mind fought to accept the reality, as if there was still some hope that this was just a nightmare she could wake up from. But the coldness emanating from her children left no doubt. Her children, whom she had promised to protect and love, were dead, victims of her own fury and despair. The shock of the discovery was overwhelming, and the pain that followed was something no mother should ever experience. She rocked them gently, as if somehow it was possible to bring them back to life, but deep down she knew there was no going back. Slowly, the despair gave way to an overwhelming sense of emptiness. Maria, who once defined herself by the love and protection she offered her children, was now the one responsible for the tragedy that had taken their lives. Her cries of pain echoed into the dark night, but nothing responded but silence. The moon, illuminating the scene of horror, seemed to be the only witness to the moment, and Maria knew that, from that point on, her life would never be the same. The torment that followed this discovery would haunt her for the rest of her days. The guilt that consumed Maria after the terrible discovery was a weight she could never bear. Every passing minute, every breath she took was an unbearable reminder of the monstrous act she had committed. The image of her children's bodies, lifeless and cold, seemed to haunt her every moment like a nightmare from which she would never wake. The physical pain of her broken heart mixed with the mental anguish, creating a spiral of despair from which she could not escape. Maria tried to hold on to any shred of sanity, but everything seemed out of reach. Guilt was her only companion. Every detail of that fateful day cruelly replayed in her mind. The laughter of her children, once full of life, now echoed in her head as a distant memory, serving only to deepen her pain. Maria knew that nothing could bring them back, and that awareness destroyed her from within. She could barely eat or sleep, tormented by the guilt that consumed her soul. The reflection in the mirror was of an unrecognizable woman, a shadow of who she once was. That place, which once brought joy to her life, had now become the backdrop of a personal tragedy she would never overcome. Over time, the guilt turned into unbearable pain. Maria felt as if she were carrying a burden that could never be lifted. Her body and mind were broken, and the only thing left was the relentless torment of guilt. She sought redemption, but she knew that nothing in the world could redeem what she had done. The nights were even worse, for as the silence of nightfall enveloped the land, the lament of her soul grew louder. It was then that Maria began to wander, as if in a desperate search for something she could never find: forgiveness. Maria's end came quietly, as though life itself was slipping away little by little, without her even realizing it. After days and nights tormented by guilt, she became a shadow of the person she once was. Her Her steps through the house were light, almost imperceptible, as though she existed between two worlds. The living, which no longer welcomed her, and the dead, where her children now resided. Pain and regret consumed her completely, leaving her at the mercy of her own suffering. Unable to bear the weight of her actions, Maria surrendered to the emptiness. Maria's death was not violent, but it carried the mark of her tragedy. The mother, who once believed she had found happiness in her escape with her husband, had now left behind a story of pain and destruction. There was no more hope, and in the end, her life ended like an echo of laments that would never be silenced. Maria's body was found on the shores of the same lake where her children had been taken from her forever. Her lifeless eyes still reflected the torment that followed her until her final moments. Before we continue with the story, if you enjoyed what you've heard, consider giving us a thumbs up, subscribing to our channel, and if you'd like, supporting us with a coffee. The donation link is in the first pinned comment. It's thanks to your support that we can continue sharing these precious moments. Maria was gone, but her story was far from over. Her lament, along with her guilt, never disappeared. In that moment, something dark and eternal was born from the depths of her broken heart. People around the lake began hearing cries during the night, a deep and anguished sound, like that of a mother calling for her children. Maria had transformed into something beyond life and death, a wandering spirit condemned to eternally search for those she herself had taken from the world. Over the years, Maria's cries began to be heard by those living near the lake. The sound, always on the darkest and quietest nights, carried with it a sense of sadness and despair that sent chills down the spines of even the most skeptical. People spoke of a woman dressed in white, with a pale face and empty eyes, wandering along the edge of the lake, weeping for her lost children. The first stories were told among the local villagers who avoided passing by the lake after sunset. Maria's legend, now known as La Llorona, began to spread, taking on a life of its own. The reports were always similar. Men, women, and even children swore they had seen a ghostly figure, always accompanied by that desperate crying. The mothers in the area began to warn their children to stay away from the lake after dusk, fearing that La Llorona might take them. They said she was looking for new children to replace the ones she had lost. Over time, the fear surrounding Maria's figure spread, and the name La Llorona became synonymous with tragedy and danger. The legend was no longer just a local story, but a grim warning to those who dared to challenge the unknown. As the legend of La Llorona grew stronger, new details emerged with each generation. Some said Maria's spirit appeared whenever a mother neglected her children, as a reminder of what could happen. Others believed she wandered in search of redemption, condemned to cry eternally for her mistakes. What everyone agreed on was that her presence brought with it an inexplicable fear. La Llorona had become more than just a legend. She was a symbol of pain and regret, a shadow looming over all who knew her story. Maria's spirit, now known as La Llorona, wandered endlessly along the shores of the lake and through nearby villages. Her cry, filled with pain and despair, could be heard from a distance, echoing through the darkest and most somber nights. Those who dared to cross her path reported feeling an intense cold, as if her very presence drained the warmth from the air around them. The slender, pale figure, wrapped in a soaked white dress, seemed to be eternally trapped in a state of torment. People who saw her described her eyes as empty, lost in a constant lament, searching for something that could never be found again. It was said that La Llorona was not just any spirit, but an entity filled with rage and sorrow. Her presence wasn't only marked by the sound of her crying, but also by the heavy, oppressive atmosphere she brought with her. Many believed that she was still searching for the children she drowned, as if she couldn't accept the fate she had sealed with her own hands. Others swore that in her search, La Llorona tried to take other children to replace the ones she lost. This caused the villagers to keep their children locked inside, especially during full moon nights, when La Llorona's crying was the loudest and most terrifying. As La Llorona wandered, her legend continued to grow. People from distant places came to the villages to witness the appearance of the weeping woman. But for the locals, there was no curiosity, only fear. She wasn't an attraction, but a warning, a constant reminder that despair and remorse could condemn even the strongest of spirits. And so, night after night, La Llorona continued her search, wandering among the living, condemned to eternally relive the worst moment of her life, searching for a redemption that would never come. La Llorona's appearances became more frequent as her legend spread to the regions around the lake. The descriptions were almost always the same. A woman in white, with a dress stained by water and long disheveled hair, slowly walking along the lakeshore or through the village streets. Her face, pale and marked by despair, was rarely seen clearly, but the sound of her crying was unmistakable. Some people spotted her from afar, while others claimed she approached their windows at night, peering in as if searching for something or someone. Reports of sightings were often accompanied by a paralyzing fear. Many who saw her described a sensation of being frozen in place, unable to move or scream. It was as if her presence brought a suffocating darkness, something that drained all hope and joy from the surroundings. Some believed that if you looked directly into her eyes, you were doomed to disappear, taken by La Llorona to the depths of the lake. Stories of children who had gotten lost or mysteriously disappeared began to be linked to the legend, further increasing the population's fear. Although the figure of La Llorona was a clear warning to many, there were those who, out of curiosity or disbelief, dared to defy the fear and sought to see her. These adventurers rarely returned with stories of bravery. Most of the time, what remained of them were haunted accounts and vacant stares, as if they had witnessed something that shook their very souls. La Llorona wasn't just a simple ghostly apparition. Her presence left deep marks, both physical and emotional. For the villagers, sightings of the woman in white were a constant reminder that tragedy and remorse could manifest in ways far more terrifying than death itself. The fear of La Llorona spread like a shadow over the villages around the lake. Each family, especially those with small children, lived under the constant threat of the weeping woman. The sound of her wail, sharp and piercing, struck fear even in the bravest of hearts, and the nights when her cry echoed seemed endless. Mothers, fearing for their children, kept their doors locked, and the elders told frightening stories to ensure that the children never ventured out alone at night. The fear that La Llorona might take an innocent child was palpable, making her a constant presence in the imaginations of the people. For many, the fear wasn't just about hearing the cry or seeing La Llorona. There was also the dread that their own lives could be touched by Maria's tragedy. Stories said that La Llorona, with her grief and remorse, was drawn to homes where family love was in ruins. Parents who neglected their children feared being visited by her, as though their own suffering could awaken the ghost who wandered in search of new victims. Those who felt guilty for past mistakes, especially those involving their children, believed that La Llorona might appear as a dark omen. Over time, La Llorona became more than just a legend. She became a warning to all who lived in the villages near the lake. Her presence, even when unseen most of the time, was felt in every corner, in every wary glance exchanged among the villagers. The mere sound of the wind through the trees or the movement of water in the lake at night was enough to make hearts race. No one was safe from La Llorona. She was the reflection of a pain everyone knew, but no one wanted to face. As the years passed, the legend of La Llorona spread far beyond the villages near the lake. Her desperate cries, her mysterious appearances, and the fear she inspired began to travel throughout the country. As travelers and merchants passed through the region, they carried with them chilling accounts of a woman in white who wandered in search of her dead children. Soon, La Llorona became a well-known figure throughout Mexico, and her story was told in distant towns and cities, where families used the legend to warn and frighten their children. The spread of the legend was swift and relentless. Each new place that heard of La Llorona adapted the story to its own beliefs and fears. What began as a local tragedy soon took on larger proportions, and La Llorona became a symbol of maternal grief and remorse. Wherever her story was told, it carried a powerful warning. Despair can lead even the strongest to the abyss. And so, La Llorona embedded herself in the popular imagination, passed down from generation to generation, shaping the fear and curiosity of thousands. As the legend expanded, different versions of the story emerged, each with its own details, but always maintaining the essence of Maria's pain. In some places, they said La Llorona appeared near rivers and lakes. In others, she wandered the streets at night, always searching for children to replace the ones she lost. The story was told and retold so many times that it became impossible to separate fact from fiction. But one thing was certain. La Llorona's cry echoed not only along the shores of the lake where her children died, but also in the hearts of all who heard her story. As the legend of La Llorona spread to different regions, each place adapted the story according to its own beliefs and traditions. In some versions, Maria was described as a wealthy and powerful woman who, after being betrayed, lost her mind and drowned her children in a fit of madness. In others, she was a humble, desperate, and lonely mother, driven to the extreme by her husband's abandonment. These versions reflected not only the cultural variations of each region, but also the specific fears and anxieties of the communities that told her story. In certain villages, La Llorona was seen as a vengeful entity, punishing neglectful mothers or fathers who didn't care for their children. She became a moral figure, a sort of warning for those who didn't value their families. In other regions, however, her figure was more tragic than threatening. La Llorona wandered as a lost soul, condemned to suffer eternally for her mistakes, but without any intention of harming anyone. In this context, her story was more of a lament about the dangers of despair and losing control of one's life. The different versions of La Llorona's story also reflected the fear of the unknown. In some cultures, it was believed that La Llorona not only cried for her children, but also sought to kidnap other children to fill the void caused by her loss. The idea that a ghostly mother could steal children as they slept terrified families, especially those living near rivers and lakes. La Llorona thus became a symbol of eternal mourning and the tragic consequences of choices made in moments of despair. The cultural impact of La Llorona was immense, crossing borders and becoming part of the folklore of various Latin American countries. Her story, filled with tragedy and mystery, has inspired artists, writers, filmmakers, and musicians over the centuries. The legend of the woman who cries for her lost children is so powerful that her figure has come to symbolize grief, guilt, and regret, universal emotions that resonate across different cultures. In many communities, La Llorona is not just a horror story, but also a reflection on the role of motherhood, sacrifice, and the devastating consequences of despair. In literature, La Llorona has been the subject of stories and poems, often exploring the emotional depth of her tale. Authors portrayed her pain as something almost tangible, a force that condemned her to wander between the world of the living and the dead. In film, her image of a woman in white, with long disheveled hair and a desperate cry, became iconic in horror films, especially those that explored urban legends and folklore. Her presence on screen is always associated with mystery and the fear of the supernatural, reinforcing her place as one of the most haunting figures in popular culture. Moreover, La Llorona has influenced music and oral traditions. Musicians from different genres have created songs that speak of her sadness and her relentless search for her children. In many communities, the stories of La Llorona are told during celebrations and gatherings, especially at night when fear feels more real. The legend has become a way of preserving the history and values of the cultures that adopted her, while also serving as a warning about the dangers of despair and guilt. Today, La Llorona is much more than just a scary story. She is a deep cultural symbol, present in art and popular imagination. In modern times, La Llorona continues to hold a central place in popular imagination, both in traditional communities and global culture. The tragic lament of the woman searching for her dead children has spanned generations, and with the arrival of digital media, her legend has spread even further. Films, TV series, and even video games explore her figure, bringing La Llorona into the modern scene as a symbol of psychological and supernatural horror. In every adaptation, her cry echoes, and the atmosphere of terror surrounding her continues to captivate audiences, especially due to her connection to universal themes like guilt, grief, and loss. In the modern era, La Llorona has come to be seen as a powerful metaphor. Her wandering spirit and her relentless search for redemption resonate in many contemporary stories, often exploring issues such as the emotional weight of motherhood and the challenges faced by women in situations of suffering and loss. Additionally, the concept of a ghostly figure wandering in search of something that can never be recovered deeply touches on the human fear of confronting one's own failures and regrets. La Llorona, then, is not just a legend, but a constant reminder that some mistakes may never be redeemed. The impact of La Llorona on the modern imagination is so great that her legend has transcended Latin American folklore, influencing popular culture worldwide. Whether as a central figure in horror films or as a story told around campfires, she remains relevant, adapting to modern sensibilities while maintaining her tragic essence. The cry of La Llorona, whether in films or stories, continues to haunt those who hear her tale, ensuring that future generations will also feel the chill her presence always provoked. Thank you for sharing this moment with us. If this story touched you, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to our channel, and if you can, support us with a small coffee through the link in the first pinned comment. Your support is essential for us to continue offering these heartfelt stories. And if you enjoyed this video, here's another story that will touch your heart even more. Click and find out what happens next. You won't want to miss it.